morning, and the board of the Institute for Science and Judaism for making this presentation possible. Now, I have to say that the only thing that is better than Jewish genetics or Jewish liturgy is Jewish geography, and not surprisingly, during the course of my time this morning, I've already discovered that I know some of you, which of course is a very wonderful thing. And as you heard, I did spend quite a few of my formative years in the neighborhood. I lived in Silver Spring, and I was a fellow at NIH as well as a medical genetics fellow and resident at Hopkins. So I'm always very happy to come back to Maryland because it feels very much like coming home to me. As you've heard, I've written this book, Legacy of Genetic History of the Jewish People. Unfortunately, we don't have any copies that you might buy this morning, but please don't let that it is available from Barnes & Noble and from Amazon and from booksellers. It's even available as an ebook, and lo and behold, here it is on my iPad. So really, you shouldn't leave home without it because you don't know when it might come in handy for you. And it was a necessity. Some of my MIT classmates said to me, Harry, it's really wonderful that you wrote this book, but we're not going to buy the paper. So we're going to wait for the ebook, and then we'll buy it. So if any of you do buy the ebook and you want me to sign your Kindle or your iPad, I would certainly be delighted to do that because it would be a first for me. So the work I'm going to talk to you about really represents a hybrid of research that I've done through the Jewish HapMap project. And the Jewish HapMap project is a spin-off, really, of the International HapMap project. As you may know, the human genome was sequenced in 2001. And on the heels of that, Francis Collins, whom you just heard about, said, well, we should now have a HapMap project to identify genetic diversity. And so NIH supported this, but they weren't interested in supporting the study of Jews, I'm very sorry to say. So we said whatever, and went out and found support within the Jewish community in order to do the Jewish HapMap project. But there was a population genetics of the Jewish people for quite some time. And I'll tell you a bit about that this morning, as well as about the work that's come out in more recent years. And so the major points that I'd like to make for this talk are that a biological basis for Jewishness can be identified. The histories of the Jewish people can be seen in their genomes. And I would argue that the stakes in Jewish population genetics are quite high. So Jews have wondered for a very long time who they are, and no less a personage than Albert Einstein, whom I actually read about quite a bit, wondered about who the Jews were as well. And he wrote in response to an invitation that he got from the Berlin rabbis in 1921 to join a shul. I notice that the word Jew is ambiguous in that it refers to nationality and origin and to faith. And he said, I'm a Jew in the first sense and not the second. So not surprisingly, he didn't join a shul. But nonetheless, he considered his ties with the Jewish people to be among the closest. And he characterized this in his autobiography, The World as I See It, which he published in 1931. And he said the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, an almost fanatical love of justice, and the desire for personal independence. These are the features of the Jewish tradition, which make me thank my lucky stars that I belong to it. Now, as you know, Einstein was offered the presidency of Israel. He declined. He did graciously consent to issue the university that they could name its medical school after him, and indeed, that's where I have the pleasure of working today. But even prior to Einstein, there were other Jews who were probing away in this issue about Jewish origins. And it's pretty well characterized by this book, Defenders of the Race. And among the important players of the time were Maurice Fishberg, of the time, meaning 100 years ago, were Maurice Fishberg and Joseph Jacobs. Both were physical anthropologists because there really weren't any geneticists at the time, although Mendel had done his work in the 1850s. It was forgotten about until the early 1900s, when it was so-called rediscovered and then popularized. So what people did at the time were look at people from different groups and try to quantify measurements that looked at head shape and height and pigmentation, and also developing a gestalt. And Fishberg describes this gestalt, which may resonate true to some of you when he said, well, it's possible to pick out a Jew from among 1,000 individuals or 1,000 non-Jews without difficulty. And Jacobs picked up on this as well. The remarkable unity of resemblance among Jews, even in different climes, seems to apply a common descent. And in his column in the Weekly Standard in 2003, Joseph Epstein, who wrote Funny But Do I Look Jewish, said, yeah, Jews remain, at least most other Jews, identifiably, unmistakably Jewish. So indeed, if we only have to look at people and know that they were Jewish, why do we need a formal genetics? Well, I'll argue to you, well, there's quite a lot more that we can learn from studying genomes. But here's an example of the calipers that Fishberg used to measure head shape. And if you measure the width and the length of the head and take the ratio, it's possible to calculate something that is called the cephalic index. And so here you can see the cephalic indices that Fishberg calculated for 500 Jewish men and 215 Jewish women. Fishberg commented about the fact that there was this so-called bimodal two-peak distribution for Jewish women that he was unable to account for. Now, Fishberg wasn't blind to his observations. He recognized that there were significant limitations in the methods that were available at the time. Nonetheless, Fishberg wrote this really wonderful book that came on the heels of a series of technical monographs that he wrote. It was published in 1911, and it was called The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment. And it's since been reissued. And it's really quite worth reading because it describes what was known about Jewish life in 2011. And in addition to cataloging the physical anthropology of Jewish people in different diaspora communities, Fishberg also wrote about their demography, about their occupations. And so it really provides a slice of life of what Jews were like in the diaspora before these massive migrations to the United States and Israel, and of course, the Holocaust occurred. Now, Fishberg also appreciated that diseases, or for that matter, resistance to disease, could be used as a marker for characterizing people. And Fishberg was a big stakeholder in this. He had graduated from NYU School of Medicine, and he found it difficult to get a job on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So he was hired by the United Hebrew Charities to be an examiner at Ellis Island, and he wanted to make sure that the Jewish immigrants who were coming through would get a fair shake. For instance, it was thought that trachoma was more prevalent among Jews. It was thought that tuberculosis was more prevalent among Jews. And so, in fact, Fishberg decided that he would do a systematic study to test whether tuberculosis was more prevalent among Jews. And so he did it in a relatively objective way for the turn of the 20th century. He looked at the death records for southern Manhattan by ward. And of course, in those days, Jews lived in certain wards on the Lower East Side, and Italian and Irish immigrants lived in other wards. So these are the Jewish wards over here. I'm sorry, I can't tell you right offhand which is Delancey Street, but it's in there somewhere. And interestingly, the deaths from tuberculosis in the Jewish wards were lower than the deaths from tuberculosis in the other wards, so disproving the notion that perhaps tuberculosis, or certainly deaths from tuberculosis, were more prevalent among Jews compared to other people. Well, this notion about diseases being a marker for Jewish origins stuck. There were certain diseases that were characterized as being Jewish diseases. Fishberg, for instance, wrote about how in the late 19th century diabetes was considered to be a Judenkrankheit, a Jewish disease. But I think it was really an immigrant disease. But in that time frame, conditions that were more prevalent among Jews, such as Tay-Sachs disease, which I'll talk about in just a minute, Berger disease, a vascular condition that can be quite severe in smokers, were characterized in Jews. But the big popularizer of the notion of Jewish diseases was Chaim Shiba, who was the first Surgeon General and the first Minister of Health in Israel. Shiba was an Austrian Jewish immigrant who came to Israel in the 30s. He thought he was going to study malaria there. In fact, he was a major player for a condition that we know as favism, or G6PD deficiency, a condition where people who eat fava beans can have massive breakdown of their red blood cells. I know there are a number of hematologists in the audience here because I'm getting very knowing looks at what I'm saying. Shiba also appreciated that people who had favism might also be sensitive to anti-malarial drugs, and in his role as a medical officer in the British Army during the Second World War, he told the British that they shouldn't give anti-malarial drugs, not only not to Sephardic Jews, but also not to Greeks or Turks or Indians or North Africans, because he appreciated that this condition was more prevalent among all of those groups. So this notion of ethnic distribution of disease was popularized by Shiba. And Shiba appreciated in turn, well, it wasn't just favism, it wasn't just Tay-Sachs, it was a whole series of diseases that were present in certain groups, but not in other groups. And as you can see from this quote from Victor McKusick, one of the fathers of medical genetics in the United States and one of my mentors at Hopkins, that this notion about ethnic distribution of disease got transmitted from Shiva to McKusick, who in turn popularized it as well. And as most of you know, the whole notion of studying different susceptibilities in different ethnic groups, whether they're genetic isolates or just geographic isolates, has really stuck. Another important player in the field was Richard Goodman, and I should note that I also know that there are some geneticists in the audience here as well, because I'm getting a knowing glance about Richard Goodman. He was a very major player in the field of Jewish genetic diseases, and his book, Genetic Diseases Among the Jewish People, was a must-own book of its era, and one would see it not only in geneticists' offices, but also in rabbis' offices, because you just needed to know about Jewish genetic diseases. And in this monograph in the 1970s, Goodman described what happened, described what happened after the State of Israel came into being in 1948. Waves of new immigrants from over 100 countries throughout the world came by land, sea, and air to the country. They were literally met at the ports of entry by teams of physicians and geneticists seeking to learn about the heritable differences and similarities of these people who had been dispersed for over 2,000 years. So the Jewish diasporas now brought together, especially in Israel, provided a great opportunity to understand the genetics of the Jewish people, but also specifically the genetics of disease susceptibilities. And the paradigm for doing this was not only the G6PD studies that were done by Shiva and his colleagues, and for that matter, competitors, but also all of the work that was done originally in the 1890s and subsequently about Tay-Sachs disease. And it's interesting when you ask people, what do you know about Jewish genetics? Typically, there are three things that they mention. The first, by far, is Tay-Sachs disease. It's Tay-Sachs disease, it's the breast cancer gene, and it's the Cohenine modal haplotype, this marker that is present among Cohenine. But perhaps nothing, Tay-Sachs disease has really had the greatest impact. And this community here in suburban Washington, in fact, was a very important player in the history of Tay-Sachs disease, because the first screening programs for Tay-Sachs disease were established here and in Baltimore by Michael Kabak and his collaborators at Johns Hopkins. Indeed, it was my experience as a medical student at Columbia setting up a Tay-Sachs screening program in the Riverdale section of the Bronx that was a formative experience for me in deciding to become a medical geneticist. And it's prevalent among Ashkenazi Jews, as this slide points out, because of founder mutations. There are these three different mutations that are found for this condition that account for about 99% of the mutations that occur among Ashkenazi Jews. Now, Tay-Sachs is a progressive neurologic disease. Kids typically start off quite normally, and yet they lose their milestones, they lose their vision, they lose their ability to swallow, and typically they die between 4 and 6 years of age. This is, in fact, the very same child shown at two different points in his life. And for families who have a child with Tay-Sachs disease, it's really quite tragic. because they thought they had a normal child, and it's only after the fact that they learned that the child is affected with this condition. The frequency of Tay-Sachs disease in the Ashkenazi Jewish population is about 1 in 2,500. So based upon one's perception, that may be rare, or in fact that may not be so rare at all. I'll show you a list of genetic conditions among Ashkenazi Jews in just a minute. If you sum all of them up, the frequencies in the Ashkenazi Jewish population are perhaps 1 in 300. So it's very likely that everyone knows someone who has a Jewish genetic disease, of the recessive type that follows the same sort of pattern of inheritance as Tay-Sachs disease. It's very likely that someone knows someone or someone knows a family who has had a child with one of these disorders. We certainly did when I was growing up, although we didn't necessarily know what the conditions were in the families that had affected children. So Tay-Sachs screening became the prototype for prevention of genetic disease, literally all genetic disease, but especially for reproductive choice, especially for recessive disorders, where in order to develop the condition, an affected person would have to have 2 copies of a mutated gene, one that he or she inherited from the mother and one from the father. And Tay-Sachs screening had a profound impact in the United States. It decreased the frequency of the condition from 40 to 50 cases per year to about 4 to 5 cases per year. And Tay-Sachs disease still occurs among Ashkenazi Jews because people don't get screened, because errors are made in the screening process, especially because physicians don't read the reports or don't understand the reports when they get them. So there's a place for tightening this up, and perhaps that will occur with the advent of wide-scale use of electronic health records in the United States. You can see that one of the paradoxical effects in this slide with Tay-Sachs screening is that Tay-Sachs has gone from being a majority Jewish disease to becoming a majority non-Jewish disease in this country. It does occur among other groups. It occurs among every group. There are some other groups that do have founder mutations, such as French Canadians and Cajuns and Irish. So it is found in the United States, and we don't have universal screening for people other than Ashkenazi Jews. Now, Tay-Sachs is one of over 40 different conditions that are prevalent among Ashkenazi Jews. This list is not up to date. It is not complete. Carl Skorecki and I published a review article in the journal Human Genetics in October, where we updated the Jewish genetic disease list, and it's not complete because there are new ones that have been described since that time. But this gives you an idea of what's on the list, and these are both recessive and dominant disorders. The dominant disorders are the conditions in which having only one copy of the mutated gene is sufficient in order to develop the condition. And these have been identified, some say because they were all studied by Jewish geneticists. There was a bias of ascertainment. To some extent that is true, but these typically have a well-defined phenotype. It's really possible to make the diagnosis for most of these without the genetic test. You can say this is what the condition is. There is a prevalent disease allele frequency, and quite often, as you saw, for instance, with Tay-Sachs disease, there's either a single major mutation or a predominant mutation that's found within the population. So these include both dominant and recessive disorders, and they may be found in other Jewish groups. Remember that Shiva said that Yemenite Jews have A and B, and Libyan Jews have C and D. So let's take a look at that. Indeed, that is the case. I appreciate that this is a rather busy table, so let me try to bring some order to it for you by highlighting a couple of points. First of all, Tay-Sachs disease is found in other Jewish groups, and that's not because of intermarriage between those groups. That's because Tay-Sachs disease has arisen several times during the course of the Jewish diasporas. There are distinct mutations that are found among Moroccan Jews and among Iraqi Jews. There are some conditions that are distinctive to some populations. For instance, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the so-called mad cow disease, is found in about 1 in 50 Libyan Jews. It is on the basis of a dominant mutation in the prion, the PRP gene. In fact, it was an important observation for proving Stanley Prusner's hypothesis about the role of prions in the development of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So there is this founder mutation among Libyan Jews who, as you'll see in just a moment, are quite a genetic isolate. And the third point from this slide is that there are conditions that are shared across Jewish groups. So, for instance, the clotting factor disorder, factor VII deficiency, is found not only among Moroccan Jews, but also among Iranian Jews. To highlight one other example, the common BRCA1 185 del gene mutation that's found in about 1% of Ashkenazi Jews is also found at very high frequency among Iraqi Jews. And so the sharing of these mutations across Jewish groups reflects two different things. One is that they may have been founded quite some time ago. They may have occurred quite some time ago and spread through the Jewish diasporas, as, for instance, occurred with G6PD. Interestingly, G6PD deficiency is not prevalent among Ashkenazi Jews. It is prevalent among Sephardic and Middle Eastern and North African Jews. And I will make the point to you in just a minute that European Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews have a common origin. But not everything gets transmitted through a population. Not everything gets selected through a population. In other instances, there may have been more recent intermarriage that occurred between various Jewish groups that led to sharing of mutations. Now, another way of reducing the complexity of these tables, though, is quite remarkably, these disorders really seem to fall within certain pathways. So this may mean that there was some common selective reason for why these disease mutations are found in Jewish populations, especially among Ashkenazi Jews. And these include, for instance, lysosomal storage diseases, of which Tay-Sachs is a representative, metabolic disorders, clotting factor disorders, which we looked at just a moment ago, disorders of adrenal hormone, steroid biosynthesis, and disorders of DNA repair. BRCA1 is not the only prevalent defect in repair of double-stranded breaks in Jewish populations, for that matter among Ashkenazi Jews. It occurs for these other conditions that are listed here as well. So I'm going to change gears now to talk a bit about population genetics. I'll show you a brief foray into my own personal population genetics, and then take you into the larger group as well. So here's a bit more about me and my family. And as you can see, I'm actually a Boston guy, but if you look at my paternal lineage, I can trace it back to the mid-19th century in Rovno, Ukraine. Interestingly, my great-grandparents on both my paternal grandfather and paternal grandmother's side came from neighboring shtetls in Ukraine, although my grandfather met my grandmother in Boston. But I think that my great-grandparents must have known about him and had their eye out for him as a candidate for their daughter. And anyway, my kids and I decided we would do an Oscar Y chromosomal study. Obviously, Oscar is not a common surname. So we looked on the internet to identify Oscars. We went to telephone directories. We invited all the male Oscars that we could to participate in our Y chromosomal lineage studies, since Y chromosomes are transmitted from father to son. And of course, this guy, Nathaniel, who's now much taller than his sisters, has the same Y chromosome that I do. And the punchline is that it's E3B, but I'll explain what that means in just a moment. I asked my cousins if they wanted to participate. My cousin Barry said to me, "Suppose we don't match?" And I said, I don't think that will be a problem. But my cousin Stephen participated. As you can see, we matched. And we did get other male Oscars to participate as well. Mitchell Oscar is a judge in New Jersey. He had been Senate aide to Senator Lattenberg. And we had 1 degree of separation. A colleague of mine at NYU kept saying to me, aren't you related to Mitchell Oscar? And so we tested it in a rigorous way. And indeed, what we found was that we were all E3B. And I'll tell you again in a minute what E3B is. But there are other ways of characterizing Y chromosomes through the use of so-called polymorphic markers. And we matched at only 11 of 25 polymorphic markers. Now, we studied another Oscar family as well, and it turned out that there were the us Oscars and the them Oscars in this study. So that's what we know about so far. I had done the study along with a company called Family Tree DNA, and I had asked them not to make my results public, but they did. And several years later, I was contacted by a biologist at SUNY Buffalo who said, well, he was E3B as well, and we matched the 25 of 25 polymorphic markers. And if one uses coalescence theory, a sort of modular clock as a way of timing events, well, the likelihood is that we would have a common male ancestor within the last 7 generations. So we, of course, played Jewish geography, and it turned out that his great-grandfather and my great-grandfather came from shtetls that were about 20 kilometers apart. So the notion of a common male ancestor seemed very likely in terms of our Jewish geography. Now, E3B is the second most common Y chromosomal type that's found among Ashkenazi Jewish men. This is a study that Jerome Bahar and others and I did quite some time ago. It's a rather busy slide. But these various circles show the different Y chromosomal types among Ashkenazi Jews. And there are 2 important features about it. One is the size of the circle itself. So that shows the proportion of Ashkenazi Jewish men who actually have that Y chromosomal type. And then the shading represents the proportion of Ashkenazi Jews to other populations. It makes the point that there are some Y chromosomal types, such as J1, J2, E3b, that are prevalent among Ashkenazi Jews, and that there are others that are prevalent among other populations, but found among Ashkenazi Jews as well. So, for instance, A1 is very common among Slavic and Central Asian populations, and I raised the issue of Cossacks there. We can talk about that later if you want. And R1b is the most common Y chromosomal type across Atlantic Europe, whereas E3b, J1, and J2 all had Middle Eastern origins. And this represented what was suspected from the blood group studies that were done in the 1970s and what was subsequently demonstrated in the whole genome studies of the 2000s, that Ashkenazi Jews have dual ancestry, European on the one part and Middle Eastern on the other part. And this is indeed what one might expect based on at least my understanding of Jewish history. Shlomo Sand has been a detractor of the work on population genetics, but he really doesn't know much population genetics to make him a detractor. But in his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, he has a really wonderful book from Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, that you can read here, which makes the argument that Jews lived all over the known world in the time of classical antiquity. And it represents the fact that Judaism was a very popular religion in classical antiquity, that many people across the known world converted to Judaism. Indeed, this map gives you an idea of where there were Jewish communities in the time of Josephus. It is estimated, for instance, that in the Roman world, that among the 60 million inhabitants, that 6 million were Jewish. So 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish. It obviously decreased precipitously after that with the rise of Christianity. But these populations across the Jewish diaspora were formed quite some time ago. Many have been stable in place, or were stable, up to the late 19th and 20th centuries. Ashkenazi Jews, of course, being an exception to that. Ashkenazi Jews thought to have had their origins in Italy, a group of people who then migrated over to the Alps into the Rhine Valley, and then subsequently to Eastern Europe. So to look at this in a more systematic way, we in the Jewish HapMap project in the United States, Carl Skorecki, Doron Bihar, and their colleagues in Israel did a whole genome analysis, and I'll show you data both from them and for us. We are friendly competitors. As I mentioned to you, Carl and I did publish an article together that reviews all of the work this past October. It's quite remarkable because we published our first article in the American Journal of Human Genetics in June of 2010, and Carl and his collaborators published their article a week later in Nature, and basically we showed the same thing. So it was like having instant confirmation for a study that you do, and from our point of view, of course, it was nice that we actually got precedence because we published a week earlier. But the point that they drew from their study is that there is this clustering of Jewish populations, that they are located between European populations up here and Middle Eastern populations down here, the different Jewish populations are characterized here: Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Moroccan, Iraqi, Iranian, and so forth. The Yemenite Jews, if you will, are something of an outlier population here. Here is data from our studies. It's another way of looking at the same sort of genetic marker analysis from throughout the genome. It's based on over 140,000 genetic markers. In the blood group days, they only had a handful of markers, but with 140,000 markers, there is a tremendous amount of power for looking at relatedness and clusters. This is a so-called nearest neighbor joining tree. And again, it makes the point that the Jewish populations here are located between the European populations here and the Middle Eastern populations down here. The North African populations are less related. We showed that in a variety of different ways in a more recent study. But the Jewish populations really tend to cluster together. And so here are the Ashkenazi, Turkish, Italian, and Greek Jews here. There is a lot of sharing that occurs between European Jews, whether they are Eastern European Jews or Southern European Jews, undoubtedly reflecting a shared ancestry. This is true whether one looks at the distances between members of these populations, or if one breaks down their genomes to look at the relative proportions of both European and Middle Eastern shared ancestry. So these are the European Jews here. These are the North African Jews here. And these are the Middle Eastern Jews here. So these represent the three major groups of the Jewish diaspora, accounting for over 90% of Jewish populations. Yemenite Jews are here, interspersed among other Middle Eastern populations. As you'll see, there is a large, in just a moment, there is a lot of sharing of DNA between Yemenite Jews and other Jewish populations. Ethiopian Jews do represent a significant outlier in the population studied. Ethiopian Jews have different genomes, they have different Y chromosomes, they have different mitochondria. For the most part, they seem to be an Ethiopian group who, in the time of classical antiquity, adopted a Jewish way of life, including a Jewish liturgy. Ethiopian Jews, for instance, did not celebrate Hanukkah until they had contact with Israeli Jewish populations, because they were formed as a population group prior to the Maccabees. So it's a way of timing events in Jewish history. Now, another way of looking at these data is to actually look at sharing of DNA strands. So one way is to look at sharing of individual markers along the genome, but one can break this up into different strands, if you will, of varying lengths, and then add them up. And so if you then measure the length of these shared strands, well, for Libyan Jews, the degree of sharing that one observes is what one would see for first cousins once removed. So they're a very endogamous population. For Iranian Jews, it's what one would observe for third cousins. And for Ashkenazi Jews, it's what one would observe for fourth to fifth cousins. So a priori, I assume most of the people in this room are of Ashkenazi Jewish origins. The degree of relatedness between any two people in this room is what one would observe for fourth to fifth cousins. So there's a very high degree of relatedness within each of these Jewish diaspora groups. Of course, people want to know exactly how I relate to you. We'll talk about that. And what's the good news and the bad news that comes along with that? We'll talk about that. as well. But there's also a lot of sharing that occurs across Jewish groups. So for instance, on the left side here, different North African groups are being compared with one another, Tunisian and German, Tunisian and Libyan, Libyan and German. On the other side, Georgian and Algerian, Italian and Ashkenazi, Italian and Iraqi. And this is different from what one observes by comparing Jewish to non-Jewish groups, which are shown in green here, or non-Jewish groups that are shown in blue here. So I tend to like to think of Jewishness as a tapestry of DNA threads that weave the Jewish people together, and that no one of these threads is a Jewish gene. Is there a Jewish gene? Richard Lewontin asked in the New York Review of Books last month. No, there is not a Jewish gene. There are a series of DNA threads that weave the Jewish people together, and none of these threads is either necessary or sufficient to identify people as Jewish. And of course, Jews as a people have been very welcoming to strangers as well. And so having a Jewish genetic background is certainly not a requirement for full membership within the Jewish community. Now, I think the stakes in this Jewish population genetics can be quite high. I tend to think that there can be a line of identity beyond belief, cultural observance, Zionism, and Holocaust remembrance. It might serve as a basis for a claim in a Jewish homeland in Israel based on Middle Eastern genetic origins. There are glorious lines of descent from Aharon the priest, but not King David. You may say, well, what does that mean? There are a number of people in different families who say that they can trace their ancestry back to the exilarch in Baghdad. The last exilarch is thought to have been a descendant of King David. Now, the problem is that when Neil Bradman, the English geneticist, did Y chromosomal studies trying to link up these different families, he was unable to do so. So it's quite possible that one of them may have been descended from King David, but not all of them have been. The strength of the Kohanim studies has been that, for instance, 2/3 of Kohanim, whether Ashkenazi or Sephardic, tend to share a Y chromosomal type. There could be absolution from price killing based on non-Semitic lines of descent. This is a point of view that Arthur Koestler, it's not unique to me, it's a point of view that Arthur Koestler argued in his book, The 13th Tribe. And the population genetics might provide insight into Jewish exceptionalism, something that I go on in considerable length in the book, but probably won't have time to talk about this morning. I would like to focus, though, on genetics as a source of shared Jewish identity, because it represents something new in terms of what binds the Jewish people together. The National Jewish Population Survey of 2000 to 2001 pointed out that most American Jewish adults observe the holidays in some way. They read a Jewish newspaper or magazine or a book, and like Einstein, they regard being Jewish as very important, and report that half or more of their close friends are Jewish. So people in the Jewish community tend to stick together in some way, even if they are not personally observant. In his book, The Holocaust of American Life, which was published in the 1990s, Peter Novick argued that of course, there have been some quite tragic examples. This journal of Lambert was published 2 years ago. She was a French Jewish woman who died in the Holocaust. And as she says in this quote, she didn't even realize that she was Jewish, but the Nazis knew that she was Jewish. Holocaust remembrance certainly is an important part of the Jewish experience, but it is not a uniquely Jewish experience because both state and federal governments have picked up the Holocaust as an important part of the American experience. Here's some of the language from the New York State law about Holocaust remembrance. Many states have laws that require that Holocaust be taught in the schools. Many cities, including this one, of course, have Holocaust museums or Holocaust memorials. We do have Holocaust Observance Day in the federal government when members of the three branches come together, as indeed we should. The Holocaust is something that should be remembered and should be taught to subsequent generations. Anti-Semitism has been an important force for holding the Jewish people together. In the 1870s, George Eliot wrote this wonderful novel called Daniel Deronda, which is about an English gentleman who, during the course of the novel, discovers his Jewish origins and is quite taken by it. In the 21st century, we would think, well, that's a really charming story, and it's got this guy discovering his origins and has a nice ethnic bent to it. But the snobby English critics at the time said, who cares about the Jews? We want to know about English people. We don't want to know about the Jews. And of course, anti-Semitism was an important part of the American Jewish experience as well, perhaps as well characterized in Laura Hobson's book, Gentleman's Agreement, which describes a WASPy journalist who, if you will, goes undercover as Jewish and personally experiences anti-Semitism. And his girlfriend, when they announce their engagement in Connecticut, it comes out that all the WASPy neighbors don't want to come to the party because he's Jewish, and it's understood in Darien that you don't sell your house or rent your cottage to Jews. And Einstein pointed out that, alas, it may be due to anti-Semitism that we've been able to preserve the cohesiveness of the Jewish people. Now, sometimes this is accrued to the benefit of Jewish people. In his chapter in his book, Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the lawyers who grew up in the 1930s, went to New York City schools when they were small, when they had small class sizes, went on to college and law school, but then couldn't get jobs in large law firms because of the extant anti-Semitism. They then went on to, within their law firms, to handle mergers and acquisitions, which of course was a very big deal. And they became the super lawyers that we know of today. The case in point that he discusses is Jeff Long from Skadden Arps, but he's representative of a whole class of lawyers. So Gladwell's argument is that anti-Semitism, in fact, may have benefited, that anti-Semitism may have benefited Jews in some way. But anti-Semitism is quite rare now. In the American Jewish Yearbook of 2007, it was noted that there are remarkably low levels of anti-Semitism in the United States. It's not that it doesn't happen, but compared to how it was in the past, it is remarkably low. And the authors of this pointed out that this followed a 50-year pattern that reflected the strengths of a pluralistic society, even as intergroup tensions in general continued to concern political leaders and social analysts. So in his 1984 book, Charles Silverman really captured all of this quite well. And he said, in the past, Jews remained Jews for one of three reasons: because they believed that's what God demanded of them, because they were born in an organic community with powerful sanctions and rewards, or because anti-Semites would not permit them to become anything else. None of these factors can be relied upon today. Although American Jews are keenly aware of anti-Semitism, there is no longer enough of it to hold the community together. So Silverman argued that Jews are Jews because they want to be Jews, and I would argue that one of these binding forces is knowing about who we are and where we come from. Now, being Jewish, of course, is not something that we categorize in the United States. In the census form of 2010, there's no place to indicate that you're Jewish on there. Even though Ashkenazi Jews, 6 million people, are America's largest genetic isolate, comprising about 2% of the population. And many people are trying to investigate their own genetic origins using testing that's available to them from do-it-yourself genetic testing companies. This company, for instance, argues that they have the largest databases in the world. I personally don't endorse any of the companies. I think they all have their individual strengths and weaknesses. But it is possible to have particular regions of your genome analyzed, or to have your whole genome analyzed. People are certainly fully sequencing their genomes right now. We're doing sequencing projects among Ashkenazi Jewish people and people from other Jewish diaspora groups. And it's possible to look at these shared segments that, for instance, are being highlighted by these colors here, that may be the ones that are shared by different people. So this is a way in which you might learn about how the person sitting next to you is related to you, and how you might be fourth cousins with one another. The only problem with that is that the knowledge has to be handled with caution, because of course that particular segment may be the segment that harbors the mutation in the BRCA1 gene. So you want to be prepared when you get that information. You want to be empowered to know what that information might mean. So I argue in Legacy that genetics is unlikely to replace the hegemony of Jewish law and Jewish culture, nor should it, but as population genetics gains a foothold in the community, with Jews and non-Jews alike wanting to know about their origins, ancestors, and relatives, it will take its place in the formation of group identity alongside shared spirituality, shared social values, and a shared cultural legacy. So thank you all very much for listening. You were first. That's a study that was was published in 2008 in the American Journal of Human Genetics by an English and Israeli collaboration, and it was based on analysis of Y chromosomes. And what was observed was that about 20% of the Y chromosomal types were of Middle Eastern origin. So and possibly Sephardic Jewish, but some of the Y chromosomal types were, might also have been of Arabic origin as well. Because of course there was a very significant Muslim presence in Spain during the Middle Ages, and so it's certainly traceable in terms of contemporary Y chromosomal analysis. We were very interested in the observation that many of these Jewish genetic disease mutations have been found in the New World, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi mutations. So we did a genome-wide study of New World people, Hispanics and Latinos, from different communities in which these mutations were found, including the Hispanics of New Mexico and Colorado, who have very high frequency of this breast cancer mutation. And they had shared ancestry as well. And so it makes the point that you were making, that Converso Jews were looking to survive the Spanish Inquisition. Some of them stayed in Spain and were forcibly converted, admixed with local populations, but many came to the New World as well. And it's possible to see remnants, if you will, or evidence of their Jewish ancestry. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could comment about the mutation of intelligence.
I talked about it before.
Why are Jews more restricted than anybody else?
Right, well, actually, I talked about both of those things in the book. I have a chapter that talks about mental illness in Jews and also about intelligence in Jews. And it's hard to ignore the fact that about 25% of Nobel Prize winners are of Ashkenazi Jewish origin. It really represents an exceptional accomplishment within the community. And even within the Ashkenazi population, there are some sub-isolates. For instance, the Hungarian Jews really stand out relative to their size of people, of being people of extraordinary accomplishment. But we don't really have good studies yet about genetics and intelligence, so it's all speculative at this point. Yes, ma'am.
Nothing was mentioned about ALS, and it seems to me that ALS and Tay-Sachs are very similar diseases, except that Tay-Sachs is a childhood disease, and ALS is an adult disease, but the results are the same.
Right, so they're both neurodegenerative diseases, examples of many neurodegenerative diseases, and for whatever reason, there doesn't appear to be a particular concentration within Jewish populations. Now, but again, it may be that it's not adequately studied yet, and that will be subject to revision in the future. Yes, sir.
How about smaller Jewish populations, for instance, like the Cochin Jews or the other Indian Jews, or some of the other Jewish populations in the Far East, that or groups that claim some sort of, well, never mind the Chinese Jews who seems to have disappeared. Has there been any look at them?
We haven't, but the Skorecki group has looked at both Indian as well as Kaifeng Jews. And there are some ties to the Middle Eastern and European Jewish populations, but for the most part, these Jews who occurred along, these Jewish populations that were formed along the Silk Road were probably formed as the result of Jewish traders or Jewish economic migrants who went to India, China, Burma, also for that matter, brought Judaism with them and for the most part converted the local population. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Parkinson's on your list as a specific Jewish disease, and especially
it certainly does. Parkinson's disease. Oh yeah, the question was about what's the story about Parkinson's disease in Ashkenazi Jews, and it turns out that there is a specific mutation that is quite prevalent among Ashkenazi Jews. It's found in a gene that is called LRRK2, and it's not specific to Ashkenazi Jews. It's found in other populations as well, but it is quite prevalent among Ashkenazi Jews. And the risk is, although it's listed as a dominant, the risk is really higher if people have 2 copies of the mutation as opposed to 1. It's something that's being actively investigated by some of my collaborators in New York, both at Columbia and Mount Sinai.
So is it an inheritable disease?
Yes, it is. There definitely is. But inheritance of a single gene doesn't seem to be sufficient for the development of Parkinson's disease. Do you have a question?
Yeah, step away from that for a second. I'm wondering if any bit of your work, either on the scientific side or how you report it, has counterpoint views or detractors or whatever, and if you could objectively characterize what aspect out there is controversial, so to speak, of what you've done.
Right. So there have been detractors to the work. Shlomo Santon, I mentioned, wrote a book, The Invention of Jewishness, and he thinks that Jewishness and Zionism in particular is really a construct of European Jews, and that it was a nationalist imperialist movement to bring Jews from Europe into Israel. You know, he is, if you will, one of these post-Zionistic Jews who, remarkably enough, lives there but doesn't like the idea of a Jewish state. And he thinks that population genetics is just bogus. For instance, when our study was published in 2010, Michael Balter wrote an article in Science magazine about it and quoted Sanders saying Hitler would have been proud. So the notion was, that we're doing work that's going to make it easier for future executioners. I have to say, I thought both the statement and the quoting in the Science magazine article, which I have to say is one of your local rags in Washington, D.C. We don't publish it in New York. What's really, outrageous. I didn't think that Hitler needed to enter the debate here. Some of the population genetics work has been uneven. Naja Abdul El-Hajj took that into question in a book that she published last spring with Cambridge University Press. Richard Lewontin, who is himself Ashkenazi Jewish but doesn't want to self-identify, is a long-standing genetics faculty member at Harvard, who doesn't really seem to be aware of the population genetics work that some of his colleagues at Harvard have done, and he really hates the idea of genetic determinism. And so in his review of Legacy in the New York Review of Books, he really took me to task about the issue of genetic determinism. So there are detractors. There were also reviewers for something called the Council of Responsible Genetics. Paul Applebaum, who's a psychiatrist at Columbia, and his wife Diane, who felt that any consideration of genetics as a basis for nationalism is truly irresponsible. So there has been controversy. Yes, John.
I'd like to ask about, for so long, Tay-Sachs was considered the most common Jewish genetic disease. Now, with all the screening that's gone on, I understand, among the Jews, Tay-Sachs is almost, eradicated. What is the percentage of Canavan disease among the Jewish population, and how is the screening going for that disease?
So Canavan is another neurodegenerative disease that's found commonly among Ashkenazi found in non-Jewish populations as well. And it's gotten picked up in panels of genetic testing, so it's been a passenger in the genetic screening, and it's been pretty effective. But it touches on the issue of, what's in a panel and what's not in a panel. There are now 18 conditions that are recommended in commonly used panels, but I've shown you, over 40 conditions for which screening might be offered. And it's been kind of hit or miss with regard to what gets into a panel, whether a laboratory decides to offer it, or for that matter, whether a professional society, such as the American College of Medical Genetics, decides to recommend it. Yes, sir, in that.
Do we know why there exists an increased risk for certain genetic abnormalities among Jewish populations, or do we only know that it exists?
Yeah, so that's a really important question, and there are two theories about that, neither of which has been proven nor disproven, and they can coexist with one another. One is the selection theory, which is based on Darwin's theory of natural selection, that it's actually advantageous to be a mutation carrier for one of these conditions. And the classic example for that, for instance, is resistance to malaria and being the carrier for sickle cell disease. But we don't really know what the selective agents might have been for these various Jewish genetic diseases. In the 1960s, an epidemiologist at NIH named Antinos Marianthopoulos argued that Tay-Sachs carriers might be more resistant to tuberculosis, and actually that fits pretty well with the data that Fishberg had amassed half a century before, but Marianthopoulos' study wasn't adequately powered statistically to prove his point. The other theory, though, is about genetic drift, and especially this deals with when you have small populations, in particular, and they're transmitting their genes, that there is, if you will, kind of luck of the draw with what gets transmitted to next populations. And so, for instance, in the case of Ashkenazi Jews, it's thought that, it's actually reasonably well demonstrated by my collaborator Itzik Per, that the population went through a tight bottleneck in its process of being formed in Eastern Europe. The size of the bottleneck may have been as small as 3,000 people. Now, obviously, now there are 6 million Ashkenazi Jews. But in this bottleneck, only certain disease mutations may have been carried through, but then as the result of the rapid population expansion that's been called the demographic miracle, you remember those days when Jews used to have 12 children, that many of these disease mutations will get transmitted. Yes, sir.
Question and a comment, if I may. The question pertains to the recent published paper from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health by an Israeli in terms of the tremendous component of hazard. And the comment, if I may, is perhaps somewhat related. It's a personal situation that I want to share in terms of how we select Ashkenazis versus Sephardi. For instance, I'm the child of two parents that are supposed to be Ashkenazi Jews. But on my father's side, there is a very strong, on my father's side, they come from a state not far away from the state where your family comes. And there is a very strong family tradition that they are Sephardics. My father and all his family were of very dark skin. And we have talked to many family members, and they said that in that part of Ukraine, they were married to Turkish women or somebody that came from the Ottoman Empire, and they were really Sephardic. So the question, actually the second question, is when we say these subjects are Ashkenazis, these subjects are Sephardics, how do we tease out the component of those
rigorous statistical tests for doing that. I didn't present all of that here, but we can, for instance, really show that Ashkenazi Jews are distinctive from Sephardic Jews, that they really form a very tight cluster, and we've done this with multiple different statistical tests. It was all in our 2010 article. We thought it was important to do that in order to put the observations on a very firm statistical basis. So there is, if you will, a measurable genetic distance between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. I did recruitment of Greek Jews in Thessaloniki and Athens, Sephardic Jews. Many of those were people whose families historically spoke Ladino, and had a history of coming from Spain. I recruited Sephardic Jews from Seattle, whose forebears had come from Turkey, got off the boat in Ellis Island, and then for some reason rode the train to Seattle, because that's where Sephardic Jews went. And it was interesting because people from those two communities were indistinguishable from one another. So we really couldn't tell the difference between Greek and Turkish Jews, whereas we could tell the difference between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. And to me, for instance, the term Sephardic is used too loosely. It's used to describe a liturgy. But North African Jews aren't Sephardic Jews. They're North African Jews. Middle Eastern Jews aren't Sephardic Jews. They're Middle Eastern Jews. It's clearly demonstrated by their genetics. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious, you said it only, thank you for first question, in passing about the FTDNA, that you had asked it not to publish something, and it did.
Yeah, probably so.
I actually did that DNA swap of teeth stuff.
Yeah.
I wasn't looking for what kind of Jews, what kind of anything. I know I'm Jewish, good enough. I was just, what other families are there? And relatives that miss me, that kind of might be an interesting idea. But I'm kind of concerned when I hear you say that you asked it not, FDNA not to, and it did it anyway.
Right, and I'm concerned about it as well, and I didn't want to dwell on it in the time. The whole realm. Yeah, the question is about do-it-yourself genetic testing, and does it follow the same sort of standard that we use, for instance, with medical testing?